Good evening. The MSP or minimum support price was established as one of the major pillars, if you remember, of the anti farm bill protest 3 years ago. And today, unfortunately, it is the major demand of the protesters. Let me give you a brief background because it's important. The concept of the MSP originated in the 1960s when we were a food grain scarce nation, not able to feed our own and dependent on third grade US wheat imports. With the coming of Borlaug's high yielding seeds and the Green Revolution, everything changed. But because the MSP encourages sanctioned loot, it has continued decades upon decades. Let me elaborate a little on this sanctioned loot. Did you know only 6% of Indian farmers benefit from the MSP? The very concept is antithetical to free market and sound economics. Logic tells you that the moment the state decides the MSP of any farm produce, it leads to excessive production of that very farm produce at the cost of other produce. And this is exactly what has happened. MSP on wheat and rice has meant that Punjab grows only these grains. The government buys only these grains, and our godowns are brimming with only these grains, brimming and rotting, with up to 30% of them going waste. Because government procurement is way over its needs that are only for PDS and buffer stock maintenance. Our buffer stock requirement for food grains is only 20 million tons, while we have stocked our godowns with 4 times as much. In fact, beginning of 2020, the government had stocked an excess of 60 million tons of food grain. And because we never involved private players in making state of the art godowns, running as we do archaic, damp, rundown storage facilities, at the onset of COVID, when we needed to distribute our food grains to the needy and the poor, as much as 6 million tons of wheat and 1.1 million tons of rice held by government was not readily issuable. A bureaucratic definition that means the food grain is substandard, partially spoiled, or completely damaged. Meanwhile, the Food Corporation is running a debt of 3 lakh crores. Unconcerned, the government, instead of decreasing the MSP for procuring these food grains, has actually increased it in the last year. And they're gloating about it. Rupees 2125 per quintal against the last year MSP of rupees 2015 per quintal. With the MSP increasing year on year to placate farmers and their middlemen and political vote banks, and the purchased food grain rotting in FCI godowns and rendered inedible, private companies find it cheaper to buy grains from sources other than the state, even import it from foreign countries. In 2017, India imported 5 million tons of wheat. This year, it has plans to import 8 million tons from Russia. Remember, with increasing MSP, cost of every value added along the chain also increases, from seeds to production to retail, leading to inflation. And with no one buying the MSP produce, its quality suffers. It goes without saying that the environmental damage for hoarding produce no one wants is immense. Did you know that if MSP was to be guaranteed for all agricultural produce, the government would be shelling out around 16 lakh crores. That's more than a third of our annual budget. But you know what the real tragedy is? Fixing of MSP. Deciding what is going to be every year the MSP for a particular farm produce. This figure and the manner in which it is arrived at is so outdated and prone to miscalculations. ICAR says Indian farmers have lost as much as 45 lakh crores due to faulty MSP pricing of produce in the last 15 years. Little surprise then that 62% of all farmers surveyed recently said they want to fix their own price for their produce. Truth is, if you turn MSP as mandatory for private companies, they will simply refuse to buy it because it will be cheaper to import produce that is edible and sellable. Also, why should the state force people to buy something at a price it has set? Are we a communist country? Fact is, even the state dumps excess produce it has hoarded at a fraction of MSP, thereby garnering huge losses. So even the government is not able to sell at MSP. And as for the Congress and its band of hypocrite intellectuals like Raghuram Rajan, they had blamed the MSP for increasing food prices back when they held power. But who wants to listen to farmers? Who wants to listen to common sense that the MSP is a Soviet era legacy where the state decides everything? For India to not meet the fate of Soviet Union, we must listen to reason and logic and not these Soviet-loving sickle ninjas. But the Soviet-loving sickle ninjas were precisely the people this government listened to. Fact is, the day the Prime Minister Modi decided to repeal the farm laws, that very day he sent a message to the world. It was a victory of anarchy over democracy, Luddism over logic, control over choice. The message was block roads, strike work, loot, kill, lay siege, and Modi will succumb. And since that day, the government asked to bend has been crawling. The Prime Minister said he repealed the farm laws for the sake of the nation. Which nation, Prime Minister? The nation whose 92% of 200 million odd farmers want these reforms? Whose 94% farmers don't even avail of the MSP? Whose 60% agricultural produce doesn't go through the APMCs? Ultimately, street veto defeated reforms. And it hurt really bad. Because if there was one sector where we needed urgent reforms, it was agriculture. That contributes only 13% to our GDP, and yet 82% of all Indian households are dependent on it. 44% of our 515 million strong labor force is involved in it. In the West, it is hardly 2 to 3%. Looted by middlemen, blackmailed by governments, defeated by elements. 3 lakh farmers have committed suicide in the last 17 years. Production to purchase, the entire chain is archaic, almost medieval. And here were reforms that promised to change all that. Tell me, which farmer in his right mind would object to deciding the price of his produce given that faulty government MSP evaluation has cost him a loss of 45 lakh crores in the last 15 years? Which farmer would object to top quality godowns set up to store his produce as the government could no longer jail godown owners on account of whimsical ECA declarations of hoarding? Which farmer would object to private companies rushing in to sign a contract with him? But these are questions only for the logical minded, not for those whose aim is to give a man a fish, not teach him how to fish. Dhanda hai ye socialism, dhanda. And socialism wins elections. You don't believe me? Here is point number 11 from the 2019 Congress manifesto under agriculture. Quote, Congress will repeal the APMC Act and make trade in agricultural produce, including exports and interstate trade, free from all restrictions, unquote. Here is point number 21 from the same Congress manifesto, quote, Essential Commodities Act belongs to the age of controls. Congress promises to replace it by an enabling law invoked only in emergency, unquote. And let me now quote from the Punjab Contract Farming Act in force when Congress was ruling Punjab. Quote, this act is to provide for improved marketing of agricultural produce through contract farming and to put in place effective infrastructure for contract farming, unquote. The 3 farm laws brought in by Modi delivered exactly on what the Congress promised or was already implementing, except that Modi had not repealed APMCs and the Congress wanted it, but just provided the farmer with a choice to go through the APMCs or not. And yet, the Congress and the middlemen protested, and yet Modi buckled. Having resisted real blackmail, unfortunately, he succumbed to emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail is easy to succumb to in this sector because, truth be told, all of us have been fed for decades on Manoj Kumar's songs of Mere Desh Ki Dharti, Sona Ugle, Ugle Heere Moti, to the extent that we have stopped considering the agriculture sector as any other economic sector. Sona ugalte ugalte na jaane kitne lakhon kisan shaheed ho gaye. Ironically, only the farmers who have a skin in the game see it just as another sector. And as I mentioned earlier, 62% of them surveyed recently said they themselves want to set the price for their produce, having suffered losses because of the faulty MSP valuation. 48% of the farmers surveyed said they don't want their next generation to take up farming. So by getting teary-eyed listening to Manoj Kumar's songs, we have only ended up pushing the farmers into this vicious cycle of a woefully managed, poorly paid, massively corrupt, badly insured, primitively tooled, environmentally damaging, unscientifically run, debt-ridden sector that employs 44% of our 515 million strong labor force and yet contributes only 13% to our GDP. Getting all these farm reforms repealed was one small step for middleman, one giant leap for socialism. And guaranteeing an MSP is meaning that we are going to make that huge leap all over again.